Welcome to 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. As physicians and scholars of the .NETs, we prescribe healthy choices in .NET-based medicines. I am your host, Scott Addy, with co-host David Pine, who, believe it or not, is wearing a hat today. I had to
long story.
intro minutes before kicking off the show. Anyways, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Niels Swimberghe, who is no stranger to the show. Niels, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself, since you've been on the show and folks have probably already played your episode over and over again?
Hello, folks. Yes, I'm Niels Swimberghe, also known as Swimberghe. I'm a software .NET developer, web developer, and I grew up in Belgium, but I'm working in the USA. You can also learn a lot about what I write about, blog about at swimberghe.net, or follow me on Twitter at realswimberghe.
Thank you. So real quick, I'm curious. I don't think we talked about this the last time. What brought you over to the US? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I did an internship here. Flemish government gave me this, or offered me this grant to do an international internship, and so I did that here in Washington D.C. I didn't know too much about the USA except for what I see from the news, and my expectations were wildly better than my expectations were lower than the reality. Actually, reality is a lot better. So.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the opposite. I was like, oh my God.
And I wouldn't be here.
Awesome.
Well, I was worried there for a minute. Thought, well, you turned on the news and saw a dumpster fire and started to regret your decision. But welcome. So with that, why don't we transition over to the checkup segment and see what David has for us over there?
Let's do it. So we do have an interesting checkup for today, relevant to the show. We're sharing build a web app with Blazor. This is a Learn module. And so if you follow the link here on the bottom, aka.ms/Blazor-WASM-tutorial, the WASM is a bit misleading. This tutorial is actually based on server side, but it's an interesting article nonetheless. So it's an introduction. I believe it was written by C# Fritz. So there's several key learning objectives. So you're going to learn how to configure your environment for Blazor development with Visual Studio Code rather than Visual Studio proper. You're going to create a new Blazor project. You're going to add components. Components are some of the key aspects of Blazor applications. We're going to show you how to update logic inside your Blazor app, because that's important. We're going to discuss data binding and event handling, and then even talk about routing. So as you work through this, there's a brief introduction on what Blazor actually is. Kind of redundant. What is Blazor? What is Blazor? I'm going to pick this apart as I read through it with you. But WebAssembly is really one of the key aspects to what I believe Blazor is going to be most powerful at in the future. It's one of the web hosting or one of the hosting models that empowers your web browser to really become more like an app store, in that it's running WebAssembly rather than just native JavaScript, and so you can get near like machine code, byte code performance. You can run C, C++, Rust, all these different target languages, and in addition to that, C#, which makes it really, really compelling. So the different hosting models are kind of called out here. WebAssembly is an open standard, so it's supported in all the major browsers. And then this tutorial, as I mentioned, was server side. So in server side, the request comes from a client to the server. The server actually does the rendering of the HTML and returns that, rather than with WebAssembly, where you get the client application, which is the WebAssembly payload. And it's much like a standard, single page application framework, like Spot framework, like Angular or Vue or React, in that the initial page load is a lot more burdensome, where you're getting basically the entire app, and then it runs client side, and then API calls update things as needed. So yeah, I encourage you to check out the tutorial. It's pretty in-depth. It talks about how to leverage the .NET CLI and Visual Studio Code, so you can instantiate a project with .NET New, Blazor Server. This is one of the templates. There's many templates, and you can actually build these out as you, you can actually build custom templates yourself, but we have a bunch that are provided for you. And this kind of just works through all the different aspects of building, running, updating, and then, as I mentioned before, components, routing, binding, all the things Blazor. So I encourage you to check it out. And with that, should we get into the bulk of the conversation? I mentioned that this does tie back to Niels' hallway track conversation, which is going to be, you're going to share actually WebAssembly, right? And Twilio and all sorts of cool, fun stuff. So let's do that.
All right. So today I'll be showing you not this side of the slides. Let's see.
Did you draw that picture of you, or is that someone else drew that?
Somebody else drew that for me.
I think we might have talked about that the last time. But every time I see that, I think, man, that's impressive. Whoever created that.
Your hair's longer now, though. Way longer, yeah. last time you couldn't see it because it wasn't popping underneath. But now it's actually so long it goes underneath. So today we'll be talking about how to make phone calls from Blazor WebAssembly with Twilio Voice. Just one thing that I didn't mention before, I work for Metrostar, and so if you're a software developer or anyone in the tech space, feel free to take a look at our careers page. We're always looking for amazing people. Now into Twilio. Twilio is a software service provider, and they actually provide a lot more than just voice communication. As you can see here, there's a lot of products actually. But what we will be talking about today is voice specifically, and to be able to call with voice, we got to also have a phone number, of course. So that's the two boxes that you see marked at the bottom left. Now, the way Twilio works generally when it comes to their communication services for developers is that, for example, a phone would call a Twilio-enabled phone number, and then Twilio will forward that information to your webhook service or your server. Because Twilio does not know by default, hey, what should I do with this phone number? So it's going to ask your server what it's going to do, what it should do. So your server will receive the information, what phone number it is, if it's a text, what the body is of the text message. And then your server is supposed to respond with TWIML. And TWIML is actually XML, but it's a special flavor of XML. So very specific verbs from Twilio that it's like a domain-specific language to explain, hey, how should I actually handle this call? So when my Twilio phone number, for example, receives a phone number, you can respond with this XML. And the XML says response, then using Alice's voice, say this message. So thanks for the call, etc. Then pause for a second, and then continue with let us know if we can help. And so then Twilio will actually say those things when it receives that XML to the person that's calling the phone number.
So the recipient of that phone call will actually hear Alice's voice on their end, and then and know to immediately hang up because it's a robot.
Possibly, yes. unless you connect it to a real person, which is actually what we're going to do today. So
nice, cool.
And so what we're going to learn today is based on an in-depth guide from the Twilio blog. And I have condensed it into what should be 45 minutes. I haven't tested the duration of this talk, but let's hope we can do it quicker.
Let's test in production.
Yes. But I did condense things so that it should be a lot faster. So I won't be running every command or writing all the code, but I will be showing you every part of the solution. And so the solution that we're going to be dissecting today is this little application. So you see its default Blazor WebAssembly template, but it has this one component on the bottom right that is this dialer. And when somebody calls your Twilio phone number, this dialer will start to vibrate or buzz, which is, to notify you, hey, you're being called. Click on this showed phone, and then you can click on the accept button to start receiving that phone call, and then you can hear it on your, whatever headphone device you're using on your computer.
I may have missed this part, Niels, but
Yeah.
the dialer here, is that a Razor component being provided by Twilio, or is this something you created?
This is something I created, yes. So we'll show how that is created later. Additionally, this components can also make outgoing phone calls. So just not just receive phone calls, but you can also put in the phone number in that dialer component and then hit call, and it will call anybody's phone number. Now, I am running a Twilio trial account for this demo, so I can only call verified phone numbers, which is just my phone number in this case. So I'm not going to call anybody but myself today.
One other question, out of curiosity, since this is a WebAssembly application, would it be possible to, I mean, since it's just a web app, presumably, wouldn't it be possible to have this work on like my iPhone? But then if so, how would you get to like the native dialer rather than your custom component? Or should you just don't answer that question and just ignore me? That's fine.
You could run it from your phone in theory, and it will use your phone microphone and speaker. No, I don't see the added value in this case because you obviously have a phone already, which you could actually use.
Yeah.
But maybe you don't want to use your personal phone number, or maybe you want to proxy. You want to use the company phone number, or it has to be for certain reasons through Twilio, because Twilio can actually do a lot of stuff in addition to just make the phone calls. Maybe it's recording and transcribing everything that goes on in that phone call to automatically go into your CRM. So there's some valid points to your ID. Now, how to use the native dialer, I have no idea. I don't know if that's possible. Like you could use your phone number to call into Twilio, and Twilio could then proxy, and then you could still have those features, I guess. And so you would, in that way, you would have the native dialer and still be using Twilio. So, some random thoughts.
Sure.
And so for this application, this is the recommended architecture, not recommended by Twilio, but by me. Now, keep in mind, this is a little bit coming from a developer that works on premises a lot. So usually on premises, you will have like a public DMZ, which is you host web applications there that actually are accessible by the public, and you would have a private DMZ, which is not accessible by the public. And so you would zone that off in those two ways. And so the Twilio access token service that you see on the left, you probably put on your private DMZ. The Twilio webhook service has to be public, so you would put that on your public DMZ. But either way, you want for both to have like a firewall in between, right, to make sure that only the things that's supposed to go through are coming through.
Thank you for sharing this architecture. I like that this is added, because a lot of times this is something that's really glossed over, and it's very important.
Yeah, and so in this case, we'll go into like how the workflow goes later. But important to notice, Twilio obviously is a cloud service, so they are out there in the public, not in your network. And so when they make requests, that needs to be on a public endpoint. And so that's where the term webhook usually comes in, meaning that you just put something that on some event can be called by some service. That's a little generic, but I hope that makes sense. Now, the demo architecture that I'm going to be showing today is actually combining the webhook service and the Twilio access token service. You could totally split them up, of course, but just for this demonstration purpose, I had merged them, but you could just split them up if you want to. And so the client running on that laptop here will be a Blazor WASM client app, and the server will be handled by ASP.NET Core. Now there's, before you can actually make outgoing phone calls or incoming receive phone calls, you need to be connected to Twilio's cloud from this client app. And so to be able to connect, you need to have an authentication token. And so that's what this ASP.NET Server access token service will provide, using some Twilio libraries and some API keys, private and public keys. It will generate this token, and then that JWT token or JA token will be received by the Blazor WASM app. And using that token, you now have permission to actually connect to Twilio and use the things that the token service actually gave permission to you, the client. And so in this case, we'll give it permission to a voice and allow incoming voice calls. And you'll see the code for that later. Now, once you do connect, it will establish this bidirectional connection over WebSocket. And that bidirectional connection is important because if you wouldn't have that connection, then Twilio would never be able to ring you. You would only be able to make outgoing calls, essentially. Now, the call itself is actually over WebRTC, not over WebSockets, I believe. And so once you have done that authentication flow, now you can start to think, how does this call flow for incoming work? So when a phone calls Twilio, Twilio then sends a request to your webhook service. Hey, this is this phone number. How do you want to handle this? Then your webhook service will return TWIML saying, hey, please connect this phone to this client, which will be the Blazor WASM app. And you will do that with this snippet of TWIML. So you can see in the response, we will dial the client identified by this string Blazor client.
So TWIML has different response subnodes. The first ones we looked at were like saying something with a specified voice and then the text within it and then pausing, for example. And then this is actually dialing, where you can specify some sort of different action.
Yeah.
Are those the only 3 kinds of nodes, or are there more nodes?
Yeah, I would recommend people check out TWIML to see the full list of capabilities, but it is quite comprehensive, and that is why I like Twilio a lot as well. They've been around for a while. They got a lot of features. So inside of here, you could have transcribe, you could have callbacks, you could start a conference call, you could take a voicemail. So there's a lot of functionality that is provided through TWIML, and all you need to do really is respond with some XML to enable that.
Out of curiosity, I started thinking about like globalization and localization and things of that nature. Since this is .NET and WebAssembly, we can use our RESX files and stuff like that. And then wouldn't it then be possible to respond with localized versions of XML? So that, but I guess, is there like some sort of negotiation that happens where like we can infer what locale the calling or the whatever called our API or webhook? Like, I'm curious about some of that stuff.
Yeah, so since this is like a webhook and you essentially have all the power of .NET to respond and generate this response, you could definitely grab those resx resources for localized content. Now, I do not know if Twilio provides some kind of hint what locale we're in, or what language the person calling speaks. You could infer it, from the country code aspect of country code piece from the phone number.
Yeah.
But many countries have multiple languages. For example, Belgium, we have 3 official languages, but then there's many more spoken. Here in the United States, we don't even have an official language. So how would you even, you could assume just to provide the most common. So what you could do is you could respond with an automated message. Hey, we can offer this call in English, Spanish, or any other language, and then please press this number to pick.
Right,
You know,
right,
and,
okay.
and then Twilio would again call your server after they made that interaction, and then from that point on, you could do that. So I think that would probably be the recommended approach.
Sure.
But I'm making a lot of assumptions here.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I'm just trying to like think of all the different scenarios here. This is really cool. We do have a question from one of our viewers. They're asking, is Twilio free?
So Twilio, you can create multiple accounts. What I mean by that, like you can sign up with email. Sorry, I just got a call here. A little distracted. So you can get you can create a profile, and for your profile, you can actually create multiple accounts, and each account starts as a trial, and that trial account comes with $15. So to play around, you essentially can do that for free. But there are some restrictions. For example, you can only call verified phone numbers, and the way you verify your phone number is through like a text message that you receive on that phone number, and then you gotta provide that text message into the portal to prove, hey, you actually own this phone number. The other restriction is that there's going to be a message played at the beginning of your phone call. Hey, this is a trial account, and then it will start your actual flow. So if you want to remove that message, then you got to upgrade to production, and there is a cost associated. And I believe the cost is, it's not much, but so it is relatively cheap, I think, the service. But every usage, every call, every text will be charged. I can't give the exact details, though. You would have to look that up.
Awesome. Thank you.
I do have a question on the TWIML markup here. In some ways, it reminds me of the days of SOAP-based services and, how performance could be an issue. Is it possible to, say, support binary responses or maybe compress this format down? I'm thinking of the situation where these TWIML responses are quite large, and it therefore serves as a performance bottleneck. Is that something you've observed? And if so, how have you addressed it?
Yeah, I have not observed that. Usually these TWIML XMLs aren't too long, so I don't think there's any performance issues. The only time that you would send binary, I think, is like when you send an MMS with like a image or something. Yeah, I don't have any experience with any performance issues like that.
Okay.
All right, let's keep going. So after you've responded with the TWIML, Twilio will know, okay, I need to dial this client. And then Twilio will use that bidirectional WebSocket that you established in the previous slide, a couple slides ago, to ping this client. And now you use the JavaScript SDK to accept a phone call. And from that moment on, you have a voice over IP connection with that phone. Now, for the outgoing call, it is very similar, but let me just show you what the difference are. At one, you see that it's point one, it's initiated by the client instead of the phone. And then we go through the TWIML request response again, and then the phone number is being dialed instead of the client. And then step 5, the connection is again established. Now, what the TWIML looks like for this is very similar, except the client has been replaced with number, and then the phone number that you're going to call is within that node.
So is caller ID required there where you show the phone number? Like, what if you omit that?
Yeah, caller ID in this case is required. So in this case, the caller ID is provided by Twilio, in the incoming call flow. When you're doing an outgoing call flow, Twilio needs to know which phone number is Twilio actually gonna make this phone call from. So this will actually be your Twilio phone number that's specified in this caller ID. And you could have multiple phone numbers. That's why you have to specify it.
Got it. Thank you.
So let's see how that's how we built this. So before touching any code, you actually need a bunch of Twilio resources. First, you need an account. I talked about that, a trial account. That's what I'm using in this case. Then you need a Twilio phone number to make those phone calls and receive those phone calls. You also need a Twiml application. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And also an API key and a secret. So to buy, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just to interrupt real quick. We did have Amir asking a question really quick on one of the previous slides. They're asking why you're using a webhook rather than the REST API that they provide. And I think...
so
go ahead.
Yeah, the REST API you can use to send text message. You might be able to send or initiate a call as well. But in this case, we're actually establishing a call between two people, one from the browser and one from the phone. And so in that case, you need those people to be present, first of all, and then I don't think you need to use that Twiml interaction in this case. I don't think there's a way to do this with the rest.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a different workflow, right? Okay.
And so to buy a phone number, you can use the Twilio CLI or you can use the console. The console is their web interface, not to be confused with CLI. But the Twilio CLI is very easy to use, and you can very quickly, buy a phone number like I'm showing here. So that's what I did here. I asked for a phone number that is in the country code US and the area code 703, which is here in Virginia. And then it listed a bunch of phone numbers, which I could scroll through, and then I picked one of them.
So a bunch of phone numbers. We have another guest asking, or viewer rather, where do they get those from? Did they just have a bunch of phone numbers that they're sitting on, or do they pull them out of midair?
Yeah, I think they own those phone numbers, or there might be some kind of standard that all carriers may be able to buy, phone numbers that are unlocked in. I'm not sure, how those things work behind the scenes. I'm sorry, but that's my guess.
That was my understanding too. It's almost like a leasing system where there's a certain number of phone numbers that are available, and then different providers can lease them, so to speak, for a time frame.
Yeah, and this is not relevant to this Twilio thing specifically, but just an interesting thing for people to take away is that a phone number doesn't uniquely identify a person like an email address does. So generally, try not to make security decisions based on a phone number, at least not over a long period of time. Because that phone number may be released like I did when I went back to Belgium after my internship. And then somebody took my phone number for a couple of years. And then when I came back, that phone number was available again. So I took it back. So within 5 years, that phone number was used by multiple people. So just be, aware of that that's possible.
The irony in that statement, though, is the fact that it's used for two-factor auth all the time, right? Get a text message on your phone and to unlock an app that you're trying to log into.
Yeah. Well, as long as it's the second factor and not the only factor, I guess it's still okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. All right. So after acquiring that phone number, I did want to show you here the JSON details. So I ran this command, Twilio phone numbers, dash colon list, and then the dash O specifies that I want this as a JSON output. If you don't specify the JSON output, you'll get less details and you'll see it in a table form instead. But the reason I want to see all these details is because of these two properties. You have the voice method and the voice URL here. And those are the webhooks for incoming phone calls. When somebody calls this Twilio phone number, where should Twilio send their HTTP requests to get to Twiml? That's where you specify this. And so by default, it is configured to this welcome message for demos. Now the Twiml application, that one will hold on to the outgoing URLs for the webhook. So you can create these applications using the CLI like this. I gave it a friendly name of Twilio Blazor phone calls, so I can easily identify it. Then when we look at the JSON details again, you can see a voice method and a voice URL. So when our Blazor WASM client will connect to the Twilio cloud, this is where Twilio cloud will post their HTTP request to. And
So-
for the API, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm curious, does Twilio provide any .NET CLI project templates that would kind of take care of some of the setup for you? And maybe it's the case that there's really not a whole lot of value there, but just curious.
Yeah, straight within the .NET CLI, I have no idea. I don't think there is, as far as I know. Yeah, I wouldn't see. I guess it would be useful to have like a starter template, something like that, and then maybe there can be some extra parameters to smoothen this up. But as far as I know, I don't know if there is.
Yeah, it's good to know. I mean, I just saw you interacting with the Twilio CLI here, and that's sort of where my mind went, because naturally not all devs are going to want to interact with the CLI.
I'm actually pasting a link. We do maintain a list of all of the available out-of-the-box C# templates from the .NET CLI that are not Microsoft owned. And Twilio is not on there as far as I can tell. But it's part of the templating engine. They could do something, or someone from the community could as well and provide them.
Trying to pick up my mental thread here. Yeah, so the next resource that we're going to need is API keys. And API keys you can also create through the Twilio CLI, but you need to have a higher authentication level than you have by default, or authorization level. So by default, when you authenticate with the Twilio CLI, you'll have a standard API key to communicate with the REST API, and that's underneath the Twilio CLI. Now, to create an API key, you actually need what's called a master key in this case. Yeah, it's called master. Since I don't have that, you could use the console in this case to create that. And then, as you can see here, this is how you create it. Let me just wait for the next page. And here you can see SID. That will be the API key, the public available or public. It's a unique identifier to identify that key. And then the secret is down below. And that one will never be shown again. So in this case, I copied that to my clipboard, put that in Notepad temporarily, and then store that somewhere else later.
And you didn't tweet it anywhere, right? It's
on the Post-it note on the monitor in front of them.
Right.
Yeah, I also didn't commit this into Git, so don't try to look there. And so if you want to learn more about those API keys, there's a blog post on the Twilio blog as well for better Twilio authentication with Twilio API keys that kind of explains the difference between the master API key and the standard API key, but also a lot of the documentation by Twilio will use the standard key just because it's a little easier to get started. Those are like called API credentials actually. Those give you way too much power. So that's where the value comes in from API keys. It's a little more manageable, and you can granularize the access to your account more. And so step 2 is now that we have those resources, we actually have to create this token service. And we'll do that by first creating an ASP.NET Core WebAPI project. And we'll update the server URL so that we don't collide with the server URL from the WASM application. And we'll have to configure those resources, those secrets and keys, add the new Twilio package, and then create that token controller. Now, the WASM project will be hosted on a different origin, which means like a different URL. There's like a difference in the port or the method or the host name, which means that by default, you can't communicate with a different origin. So by default, the access token service and the Blazor WASM client aren't allowed to communicate. this course or cross-origin resource sharing will resolve that issue by explicitly allowing that communication. So the first step would be to create that web API. So that's the command I ran for that. Then in the launch settings.json, which you can see the path here, I updated these application URLs. These are the application URLs that come out of the box with every web template. So if you would have two web templates like the WASM client and the web API, and you would try to run them at the same time, they'll try to run at the same port on your local host, which will cause port collision. So one of them will crash. So that's what we're trying to go around here by changing the ports to 5003 and 5002. Now, the reason I strongly recommend use Twilio CLI is you can then start scripting these things out more, especially for demos that will be a lot easier to quicken things up. So in this case, I'm using some PowerShell to actually take in those variables, those resources from Twilio. So over here, I'm going to ask for the account SID. Then I'll ask for the Twilio phone number, the API key, API secret, and the application SID. And then I'm going to grab this project name where I want to configure these secrets inside of the user secrets store. And the user secrets store is just for development purposes. So this is very a great tool to store your secrets locally, but that is not something that will be available to you in production, for example. And I do have to say that this does still store your secrets in plain text. It's just in a specific location where only your user account is supposed to be able to access them. The other people that are able to access that will be administrators on your computer where you store that as well.
Yeah, the benefit there of this user secrets is it'll store those in your user profile on your development machine. So outside of the directory where your source code for the application is stored, therefore reducing the chances that you do a YOLO push to GitHub and share your secrets with the world.
Yep. And so when I run this, this will look like this, and that's the step I took. And then the only different kind of piece was this special one that asks for a secure string. And that's because I didn't want to share you my secret. So that's why it was like start out. That does also mean that, since it's stored as a secure string, I have to translate that back to a normal string if I want to store it. So that's that extra code here. That's different than the rest. Now, next step, you actually have to add the NuGet package to be able to generate that token. There might be, some other ways to do this as well. But Twilio provides this easy-to-use library to generate that JA token for you. And so I created this token controller, add token, so the URL will be /token. And here, okay, actually, I'm going to actually go into the code here. There we go. Is this big enough for everyone?
Yeah, I made you full screen now too. It looks good. Maybe you could bump it up. I guess maybe one more. And
there we go.
Perfect.
This token controller will take some configuration, and that is to get those resources again that we stored into user secrets just a little bit before. And so what we'll need is the account SID, API key secret, and the TWIML. And so in this JA token, we'll give it a grant to voice, to use voice. And then we'll also explicitly allow that incoming calls are allowed. And since we stored those webhooks on the TWIML application, Twilio also needs to know about that. So this is how Twilio will know when they decrypt that JA token, hey, which application should I fetch, and then which webhooks should I communicate with. And then when you put all of this together, it will create this token and transform it into a JA token. Now, the last thing that I do want to show here is Blazor client. That's the identity. And this is where it has to match with that TWIML that will be returned. Otherwise, if it doesn't match, it won't know who to call for incoming calls.
And that was the client node inside the TWIML that we had showed before.
Yep.
Okay.
So next step would be that course setup. And actually, I think I have this all in here. Gotta swap again. So in the startup class, we add this course node or course code. We add a policy, and the policy name is this Blazor client policy. And then we explicitly tell which origins that we're going to allow. And these two origins are the origins that the Blazor WASM client is going to be hosted on. And then you also got to add this use course line in the configure method. Additionally, you also need to mark your controller method or controller as a whole, a control action or a controller as a whole with this enable course attribute. And again, with that identifier, which identifies that specific policy that we configured in the startup class. Now, if you want to verify that your token is working, you can quickly verify that with PowerShell. Now, out of the box with .NET 5, what is it with .NET 5 or is it with, I think it's with .NET 5, you will start to have, it's not called Swashbuckle anymore. What's the other name?
Open API or Swagger?
Yeah, they will have the Swagger URL and endpoint that might be even easier to to test this out. But since I created this one with 3.1, I'm just using this PowerShell request to quickly verify, hey, I'm getting this token back. And then I also verified that course is working by sending this PowerShell web request. And so for verifying cross-origin resource sharing, you got to use this options method instead of get or post, and pass these headers. And so I added these headers, get, and then origin X requested with, and then the most important part is this origin, which is the origin that I'm calling, that the browser, that the client will be calling from. And then to see if it's working, the response has to have this header, access control, allow origin, HTTPS, and then this. If this is returned, then that will allow your browser to communicate with the service. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Twilio JavaScript SDK. So first of all, I am going to run my client.
So out of curiosity, real quick, you just showed a Twilio JavaScript SDK. So I'm assuming that there's some sort of WebAssembly interop that's happening between the JavaScript stuff.
Yep.
For Blazor, okay.
And so I'm launching this Blazor WASM app that we'll talk about more later, but we're not going to use the WASM app. We're just going to stay inside of the console for now. So I'm going to clear our output. Now, what I do want to show here is I included the JavaScript SDK through Twilio's CDN. Now, they recommend you host this yourself, but for demo purposes, you can use this CDN to get started quicker.
Yeah, that's just a recommendation. That just means don't use our server, use yours.
Yeah. Let me run the token server as well, because I'm going to fetch that Twilio token, that JA token. And so, first of all, we need to get that token. So I'm going to make a response using fetch pre/token. So this response should now contain that JA token, and to get that token, I need to unwrap this response. Now you can see that JA token. I'm going to clear so people aren't fast enough to copy it. There's not too much harm, so it's okay if you do. Please don't sabotage me right now.
That would be really hard to copy.
So now I can create this new Twilio device, and this Twilio device think of this as a virtual phone in your browser. And
Can
so
you
with
zoom in on
this-
the console a little bit, please?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So
Perfect.
now to set up this Twilio device, to enable that it's working, we'll call the setup method and pass in the token so that it can authenticate with Twilio. Now, from the moment I do this, in the network tab, you'll see this signal. And this signal is the bidirectional communication that is happening between Twilio and your application. So under the messages tab, you'll be able to track what Twilio sends and what you send to Twilio. Back to the console. Yeah, go ahead.
That looked like that was WebSockets.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Did I say something else?
No, you had WebSockets on your slide earlier.
Okay, I was just
Okay. I just said bidirectional communication instead of WebSocket. Yeah, I forgot to specify. This is a WebSocket.
Awesome.
And so let me grab some more code. There is some events that this SDK comes with. So you have the ready event, error, connect, disconnect, incoming, and cancel. And so whenever you either start calling or you receive a call, these events will start to trigger. And so what we'll do later with the Blazor WASM is when these events happen, let the Blazor WASM component know that this event happened so that it can update its state and then render the component appropriately. And then lastly, start a call, you say device.connect, and this object will just be passed on to your webhook. So this could be anything. This is not like a specific API. You could change this to anything you want, as long as your webhook knows the correct parameter to call. Now, we haven't configured those webhooks at this point, so that won't do much.
Thank you for using your demo account. Please upgrade to a full account to remove this message.
Did you all hear that?
Thanks for the call.
Yep.
Configure your number's voice URL to change this message.
So that was Alice.
Let us know if we can help you in any way during your development.
So that's the demo TWIML that we showed all the way in the beginning of the slides.
Woo, woo. Can we applause real quick? Because audio is working. It's coming through. A demo happened. And I just want to tip my hat to you because I felt so alone using the console all the time to mess around and interact with JavaScript bits. And you just made me feel a lot better, Niels. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, by default, that webhook is actually configured to null. But once you update it, you can't set it back to null. So I set it back to this demo TWIML that Twilio provides. Now I see we have 12 minutes left, so I'm going to kick things a little faster.
Only 90 more slides. Not a big deal.
Let's see, where are we? All right, so now we have to implement these webhooks ourselves. So instead of using Twilio's default TWIML, we'll have to respond to these ourselves. And then to make our local development environment public, we'll use ngrok to tunnel it to a public URL. And then once we have that public URL, we can update the webhooks. So the voice controller that I added looks like this. It looks like this. So we have another route at voice/outgoing. It will go to the action inside of the voice controller. And then it will grab my Twilio phone number. And it will create these .NET objects that are, this API is provided by a Twilio package. And so you create this voice response, create a dial, and then configure that dial with the caller ID, which is the Twilio phone number, and then which phone number you actually want to dial, and it's appended to the response, and then return it as TWIML. So that will generate that XML.
We had a real quick question from Amir. They're asking if ngrok is safe, like security-wise.
So you'll make your service public, so you'll have to deal with the implication of that. But for development purposes, this is a good tool to use. I wouldn't use it for production though.
Thank you.
Let me show that other controller as well for the incoming. Is my Visual Studio Code going to render? Yes, there we go. So the voice controller here. For the incoming one, I'm going to collapse this privacy mode. So you're going to accept a from parameter. So that will be the phone number that Twilio will be passing on to you, who is dialing you. Then you create a voice response again. But instead of dialing a number, which we did up here, we're going to dial the client. And here's that string that has to match with what you did in the token. And so using PowerShell, I quickly verified again that this works. You see the XML here and here. And so what we're going to do now is use ngrok, this free tool to tunnel your web servers publicly, to make this publicly available. So let me just open this tab, ngrok HTTP localhost. I'm only going to open up the HTTPS one because I want this to be secure. ngrok will give you a HTTP URL and an HTTPS URL. And so we only want to configure this HTTPS URL because between Twilio and your webhook, you want that communication to be secure. Now, I have some PowerShell to quickly update repos Twilio webhooks. And so I'm going to quickly show what that does.
I think it's at the bottom.
Webhooks. So I stored the application ID up here and the Twilio phone number, and I'll use those two variables to uniquely identify inside of the Twilio CLI which phone number and application that I want to update. So I want to update this application ID with this URL, and the URL will be constructed based on the ngrok URL. And so the way that I'm figuring out what the ngrok URL is using the ngrok API that is running right now locally. We'll say tunnels, and here you can see all those details. Now it's showing it in XML, and PowerShell, it will actually receive it in JSON by default. And so I'll filter out to make sure that I only grab this HTTPS one. And so based on that, I'm going to configure the URL, the public ngrok URL with voice outgoing and voice incoming. So let's run that. There we go. And then let's see, Twilio phone numbers list, and then JSON. So verify that we have that that it's been updated. Here we go. We have that voice URL that's updated now, and that should come into our voice controller locally. All right, next step. Where are my slides? All right, so we can go back to the shell to actually make a phone call. And I'm going to make a phone call to my phone number. So I'm going to drag this. I'm not, you can't see my browser console anymore, right?
Correct.
Because
I'm going to type in my phone number, and I don't want you to know that.
But we want to call you. Let's be
It was
friends.
funny because when Niels got a call earlier, my phone rang almost immediately after that.
That's funny.
All right, I typed it in, and I'm going to clear the console history so I can't accidentally go up. And now I can actually call myself. Let's say connect. And I'll pass in my phone number. My phone number.
Thank you for using your demo account. Please upgrade to a full account to remove this message.
Let's see if I get this on my phone number.
Believe in yourself. Test and prod.
All right,
Victor,
so I got this phone number here.
I have a feeling Victor and I would get along quite well.
Hello.
And prod.
There's an echo. I heard it. It works.
And so there's a couple of extra things. I'm not going to show them because we're short on time. But on the active connection, you can disconnect. So cancel the connection, stop calling. You can also accept if there's an incoming voice call. You can also reject the incoming voice call. Now you also want to clean up using the destroy command.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. Very, very well orchestrated. There's a lot of moving parts. You explained them all very, very well. So thank you for that.
That is the tough part with this tutorial, why it's so long and took so long to develop, is because there are so many moving pieces. Now we have 5 minutes to explain how to do this client actually. So hopefully people can go into that blog post to learn more, but I'll try to get through as much as possible.
I did share the link for that too.
Awesome. So I created a Blazor WASM application like this. Then I added the SDK, which I showed before, is this link. And then I created that dialer component, which is over here under the client components dialer. So I created that. I added some CSS, some JavaScript, and .NET Interop. Now, .NET Interop is an entire session by itself. And I have a lot of samples actually on this that you can run in the browser live. For example, here, this is, you see the source, you see some explanation, and you see it live. The important part to know is @inject will give you this IGS runtime, which allows you to, on this object, you can then call invoke or invoke async. Let's see if there's an example here. Yeah, invoke void async or invoke async, which allows you to call a JavaScript method from your Blazor component using .NET. Now that method has to be publicly available because we don't have a reference to a JavaScript object or something like this. Now there's also the opposite is possible. You can also call into .NET functions from JavaScript, and they have to be static functions if you don't have a .NET object reference. Let's see, yes, call that methods from.
And there was actually a previous example that you were showing the .NET object reference creation where you were passing it into JavaScript.
So here you invoke a static method, and this is the assembly name that you need to provide. Now you can also invoke on a specific .NET object, and for that you first need to create. Let's actually go to the dialer. So object reference. So you use .NET object reference.create to create an object reference in .NET. And in this case, I'm actually going to use this, which is the dialer component itself, just to make it easier to communicate between the component and the JavaScript. And this .NET object reference, I'm going to pass into JavaScript when I'm calling into this globally available JavaScript method. Now let's go into dialer.js. Here, instead of .NET object reference, I'm accepting that .NET object reference. And so now that I have this available for all my other functions, I can call back into .NET to let .NET know, hey, on ready, call this method on error, call this method. And then I'm going to update the appropriate state inside of my dialer components. And the appropriate state is mostly up here, some booleans, whether to show the dialer, the message, etc. And so here you have those invocable methods from JavaScript where I'm updating the state.
Perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, I think we're getting close to our time box. I'm going to throw up this banner real quick here for next week's show. And Scott, you can bring us home.
Yep, we got the banner rolling already. Thank you for that. So I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning into today's show and learning from Niels, sharing his knowledge with us. This has been the .NET Doc Show. Be sure to check out recordings, upcoming topics, and more at our official website, .NETDocs.dev. If you tune in next week, as the banner below says, we'll be joined by Conrad Kokosa, who will discuss an out-of-memory card game that he's developed, and it's based on Blazor and Azure Functions. So the Blazor love continues yet again next week. That's it for today. Again, thank you to everyone for tuning in, and big shout out to Niels for returning to the show and dealing with us.
Thank you, everybody.
And thanks. Bye, friends.
Bye.